Richard Sterling stood in the blistering July heat, staring at the bone-dry concrete of his main irrigation canal. The massive steel valves were cranked wide open, but nothing was coming out. His 2,000 acres of pristine, high-yield almonds were beginning to wilt in the sun. Just across the rusted barbed wire fence, Elias Vance leaned against a battered 1,945 cable-tool drilling rig, adjusting his oil-stained cap. Elias watched as hundreds of gallons of crystal-clear, ice-cold water surged from the earth, flooding his 90 acres of thriving green crops. 6 months earlier, Richard Sterling had legally choked off Elias's water supply, smirked from the window of his air-conditioned truck, and told the young man to pack his bags. But Elias didn't pack. He dug. And what he tapped into didn't just save his family's farm, it literally dried up Richard's entire operation. Before I tell you how a broke mechanic used a rusted piece of World War II-era iron to outsmart the richest and most arrogant man in the county, let me stop and say something. Here, at Harvested Histories, we unearth the buried legends of rural America, the men and women who were counted out, the handshake deals that went south, and the relentless grit that kept family farms alive when the deck was stacked against them. If you believe these kinds of hard-fought underdog victories still matter today, hit that subscribe button right now. My high school guidance counselor told me there was no audience for old farming tales and that I was wasting my time. Help me prove him wrong. Because the story I'm about to tell you is an absolute masterclass in taking revenge with your own two hands. Let's go back to February 1978 in the dust-choked heat of California's Central Valley. Elias Vance was 30 years old. He didn't come from generational wealth. He had calloused hands permanently stained with grease from 10 years of fixing other people's broken tractors. He took his entire life savings, a measly $14,000, kept in a steel lockbox, and bought a neglected 90-acre plot of land that had been sitting vacant for a decade. The land was overgrown, the fences were sagging, and the soil was hard as concrete. But it was his, paid for in cash, zero debt. The problem wasn't the land. The problem was the neighbor. The 90 acres bordered Sterling agribusiness. Richard Sterling was 55 years old, a third-generation corporate farmer who wore custom-made boots that never saw a day of actual mud. He drove a brand-new Cadillac down the county dirt roads and controlled 2,000 acres of the valley. Richard had been trying to buy Elias's 90 acres for years to square off his massive empire, but the previous owner had refused to sell to him out of pure spite. On Elias's second day on the property, Richard's Cadillac rolled up the driveway. Richard didn't get out of the car. He just rolled down the window and looked at Elias, who was underneath a broken-down disc harrow with a wrench. "You're the mechanic who bought this dirt," Richard said, not asking a question. "I'll give you $20,000 for the deed right now. You make a quick $6,000 profit, and you can go back to turning wrenches where you belong." Elias slid out from under the harrow, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked Richard in the eye. "Not for sale, Mr. Sterling. I'm going to farm it." Richard let out a short, cold laugh. "You can't farm without water, boy, and water flows downhill. I own the hill, and I sit on the Water District Board. Sell it now, or you'll be giving it to me for free by August." Richard wasn't making an empty threat. By 1978, surface water in the valley was tightly controlled by local water boards, which were heavily populated by mega-farmers like Richard. 2 weeks before the spring planting season, Elias received a certified letter from the county water district, citing a forgotten, obscure loophole from a 1932 local charter. The board had voted to reallocate the surface water rights in Elias's sector. Elias's access to the main irrigation canal was capped at a strict residential limit. It was barely enough to water a lawn, let alone 90 acres of crops. Elias went to the water board office. He argued. He showed them the original deed, but the board just shook their heads. It was perfectly legal, they claimed. Richard Sterling happened to be in the office that day, drinking a cup of coffee. As Elias was walking out, furious and out of options, Richard smirked over the rim of his cup. "Told you," Richard whispered. "Pack your bags." Most men would have quit right there. You can't fight a millionaire with a lawyer on retainer when you barely have money for seed. But Elias remembered something an old-timer at the tractor shop had once told him about the valley. Before the massive concrete canals were poured in the 1950s, the old pioneers used to pull water straight from deep rock artesian aquifers. Elias didn't hire a lawyer. He went to the basement of the county archives. He spent 4 sleepless nights digging through geological surveys from the 1920s. On a crumbling, hand-drawn map from 1922, he found it, a massive, pressurized underground aquifer that ran deep beneath his 90 acres. The original pioneers had drilled a well, but they capped it and abandoned it in 1935 when the steel casing shattered on solid granite. The modern farmers, like Richard, didn't even know it was down there, because they relied entirely on the easy surface water from the canals. Elias had the water. He just had to reach it. But it was 300 feet down, trapped beneath a thick shelf of solid granite. A modern rotary drilling company quoted him $25,000 to punch through it. Elias had $300 left to his name. So, he did what corporate farmers like Richard Sterling could never understand. He went to a scrapyard and bought a rusted, abandoned 1945 Bucyrus Erie cable tool drilling rig for $150. It was considered absolute junk. The engine was seized, the belts were rotted, and the heavy steel drill bit was dull as a butter knife. Elias towed it home. For 3 weeks, he worked 1 8-hour days. He rebuilt the engine using parts he machined himself. He reforged the massive steel drill bit in a homemade forge, heating it red hot and swinging a sledgehammer until his hands bled to get the edge back. While Richard's farm workers drove brand-new, debt-financed John Deere tractors past Elias's property, pointing and laughing at the crazy mechanic playing in the dirt, Elias just kept working. By mid-April, the old Bucyrus Erie roared to life, billowing black smoke. Cable tool drilling is agonizingly slow. It relies on lifting a massive steel chisel and dropping it over and over, shattering the rock inch by inch. Thud, thud, thud. The sound echoed across the valley day and night. Richard Sterling drove by one afternoon, stopped his Cadillac, and yelled over the noise. "You're digging for ghosts, Elias. You're gonna go bankrupt before you hit mud." Elias didn't even look up. He just pulled the lever and let the steel drop again. I want to pause the story right here and ask you a question. Have you ever had someone pull the rug out from under you, doing something completely legal but entirely immoral just because they had more money and power than you? And when they did you roll over, or did you find a way to dig deeper? Tell me about it in the comments right now. Because what Elias hits at the bottom of that 300 foothole is going to resonate with anyone who has ever had to fight their way back from rock bottom. Let me tell you about the last week of May, 1978, because this is where Elias Vance went from being a crazy mechanic to a local legend. The temperature in the valley had hit 102 degrees. Elias was on his 41st straight day of drilling. He was down 295 feet, covered in mud, grease, and sweat. The old Bucyrus Erie rig was shaking so violently that the rusted frame looked like it was going to rattle apart. Then, the rhythm changed. Instead of the loud, grinding thud of the steel bit smashing into solid granite, there was a hollow, echoing crack. A deep, terrifying rumble started vibrating through the soles of Elias's boots. It sounded like a freight train was rushing up from the center of the earth. Elias barely had time to throw the rig's heavy levers into reverse and winch the steel bit upward before the ground blew open. A geyser of thick brown mud shot out of the 6-inch steel casing, followed instantly by a roaring column of crystal-clear, ice-cold water that blasted 30 feet into the blazing California sky. It was a fully pressurized artesian aquifer. It didn't need a pump. It didn't need electricity. It flowed with the unstoppable force of a fire hydrant driven by millions of tons of natural pressure from the distant Sierra Nevada mountains. Elias didn't celebrate. He grabbed his wrenches, fought his way through the freezing downpour, and wrestled a massive iron cap and valve system onto the wellhead. Within 48 hours, He had trenched his fields and opened the valves. His 90 acres were suddenly flooded with the purest, most mineral-rich water in the county. While the rest of the valley baked in the summer heat, Elias planted a late crop of alfalfa and watched it explode into a sea of emerald green. But here is where the story takes a turn that nobody, not Elias, not the water board, and certainly not Richard Sterling, could have ever predicted. You see, Richard Sterling's entire 2,000-acre agribusiness relied heavily on the massive concrete surface canals that crisscrossed the valley. But what Richard's highly paid engineers had forgotten was basic hydrogeology. Those shallow surface canals were naturally supported by the upward hydrostatic pressure of the deep aquifers below them. Elias hadn't just tapped a small, isolated underground puddle. He had unsealed the valley's primary deep-pressure artery, as Elias's well flowed freely. The pressure dynamics beneath the hill shifted. The water that usually seeped upward to keep Richard's surface canals topped off was now taking the path of least resistance straight up Elias's steel casing. By late July, the unthinkable happened. Richard Sterling's main concrete irrigation canal dropped to a muddy trickle. His massive, thirsty almond orchards began to yellow and wilt. Richard panicked. He hired a private hydrologist from the city to figure out what was happening. The hydrologist ran his tests, drove over to the property line, looked at Elias's roaring artesian well, and delivered the bad news. The mechanic tapped the mother lode. The hydrologist told Richard, "He's drawing the pressure right out from under your hill. The only way you can water your 2,000 acres now is to drill your own deep rock wells." But there was a massive problem. Richard couldn't drill. To sink deep rock wells across 2,000 acres would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And Richard Sterling, the millionaire who drove the Cadillac, was leveraged to the absolute limit. He was drowning in debt from new harvesting facilities, luxury trucks, and land he'd bought at peak prices. The bank took one look at his failing almond crop and refused to extend his credit a single dollar further. Let me tell you about the summer of 1981, because this is where the bill finally comes due. When the early '80s financial crisis hit, interest rates skyrocketed to over 20%. Richard's variable rate loans crushed him overnight. His almond yields plummeted because his trees were starved for water. The empire he built on debt and arrogance came crashing down. The bank called his loans and moved to foreclose on Sterling agribusiness. The day before the county bank auction, Richard's Cadillac, now covered in valley dust and missing a hubcap, pulled up to the barbed wire fence. Elias was leaning against his 1,945 drilling rig, wiping grease off his hands. Richard rolled down the window. The smirk he had worn 3 years earlier was completely gone. He looked exhausted. Beaten. "You ruined me, Elias," Richard said, his voice hollow. "You dug that well just to dry me out." Elias walked up to the fence. He didn't gloat. He just looked at the man who had tried to erase him. "I didn't ruin you, Mr. Sterling," Elias said quietly. "I just dug a hole so my family could survive. The bank ruined you. The debt ruined you. You spent your whole life trying to control the water on the surface, but you never bothered to learn what was holding it up from underneath." Richard stared at the steering wheel for a long moment, put the car in gear, and drove away. The next morning at the county courthouse steps, Elias Vance showed up. He didn't bring a lawyer. He didn't bring a loan officer. Using the profits from 3 years of bumper crops fueled by free, limitless water and zero overhead, Elias bought 400 acres of Richard Sterling's prime almond orchards. He paid the auctioneer in a cashier's check, bought with cash. Elias farmed that land for another 35 years. He eventually expanded to 800 acres, always paying in cash, always refusing to carry a mortgage. He never bought a brand new tractor, preferring to rebuild old iron in his workshop. He kept the rusted Bucyrus Erie drilling rig parked right next to the wellhead as a monument to what saved him. But Elias didn't keep his success to himself. When young, broke farmers in the valley were struggling through the droughts of the 1990s, Elias didn't tell them to pack their bags. He didn't smirk at them from a luxury truck. He ran irrigation pipes from his artesian well straight across the property lines, letting his neighbors water their dying crops for free until they could get back on their feet. When people asked him why he gave his water away, Elias would just point to the old drilling rig and say, "Because I remember what it feels like to be thirsty, and I remember what it feels like to be told I don't belong here." The rich farmer told a broke mechanic he couldn't farm without his permission. He legally cut off his water, smirked, and waited for him to fail. 3 years later, the mechanic owned the millionaire's land, and the millionaire was out of business. Because Elias Vance understood something the corporate farmers never did, the people who try to bury you usually forget that you know how to dig. If this story proved to you that hard work, zero debt, and old-school grit will always outlast arrogance and leverage, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, subscribe to this channel for more stories about the forgotten underdogs who built rural America with their bare hands. Second, drop a comment and tell me what is the most satisfying moment you've ever had proving a doubter wrong. Were you right in the end? And third, share this video with someone who is currently fighting a battle that everyone else says they will lose. They need to hear that a dry canal isn't the end of the road. It just means it's time to dig deeper. The rich man smirked and cut off the water. Elias kept digging, and the earth rewarded him. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.